This is the narrated PowerPoint on qualitative research. Those are the Yanomami. They're South American people who live in Brazil and Venezuela and other parts of South America. And we'll be talking a little bit about them in the context of qualitative research. So, qualitative and ethnographic research. I tend to use the terms interchangeably, and I thought in this slideshow, and I thought I would clarify what the differences are. So, what is the difference? Well, qualitative is the umbrella term. In other words, ethnographic research is a type of qualitative research. Ethnographic research tends to go out and to experience a particular population, and it could be going to the South American rainforest to live with the Yanomami, or it could be going into a college fraternity and living there. And people have done those types of studies where they've lived in a dormitory or something like that to try to learn more about college students. So those are ethnographic research is a particular type, but a teacher studying their students in a classroom, that's qualitative research, certainly. This type of human-centered research that we do, and we often use the methodologies of the physical sciences and or at least the statistical applications of the physical sciences and the life sciences to increase our knowledge. So I thought I would clarify that before we went any further. So a good place to start with ethnographic research is with a research question. How about if we started with one like this? Have the Yanomami been treated unfairly by Western researchers? Well, that's a little vague. What do we mean by unfairly? Do we mean that they that the researchers got paid and the Yanomami did not? How about if we changed it to, could Western researchers have prevented the 1968 measles outbreak among the Yanomami? That's more specific. It's certainly something that seemed like we would have learned from, especially with we know about the encounters with Native Americans that exposed them to diseases that were devastating to their societies. Well, the same thing actually happened with between the conquistadors and the Inca and the Mayan when they were first encountered by Europeans. So the researcher's perspective, there's a couple of terms that are important. They're actually linguistic terms. One is etic. This is when you're an outsider to the community that you might be studying, or the group of people you're studying. The other is emic, when you're an insider. You're looking for culturally meaningful data. We see this emic research in a sense when people are writing book reviews and movie reviews, reviews of art shows and things like that, in the sense that we're trying to make sense of artifacts of our culture to find meaning. And then here we have the idea of the autoethnography. That's when you study yourself. A lot of teachers will do this. They will study their class, maybe study a new approach to material that hasn't been tried before. And a lot of times people in the social sciences and the physical sciences, they look down on qualitative research in general, saying that it doesn't have sufficient scientific rigor that theirs do, that that if you're going to study a class, it should be a class you're not involved with. So sometimes teachers will do this anyway. They might have two classes that they'll study, one theirs, and then use the same materials or not in another class. It's a kind of a control group. I did this once myself with looking at the way that a listserv can create a sense of community in a classroom. And we used a research tool, a survey, to that has had a track record for measuring community in groups, and we applied it to a group that wasn't one of my classes. Someone else was teaching it and weren't using a listserv, and then we also applied it to mine as well. So I got some meaningful data out of that. It was kind of a pre-study. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So your stance: are you going to be a complete observer? That is, you're etic. You're on the outside looking in. Or are you going to be a participant as observer? So, in other words, someone who is studying the Yanomami would, if they were a participant as an observer, they would be participating in the tribe's day-to-day life, but still, being outside of it in a sense. They would still be wearing their Western clothes and perhaps eating their Western foods and things like that. Sleeping in a tent, the sleeping bag, and mosquito netting. Will you be a complete participant? That is, you're going to put on a loincloth and you're going to put decorative tattoos on your face and eat snakes and different types of jungle creatures that the Yanomami eat as well. Take place in tribal rituals. Or will you be the observer as participant? And the observer as participant, obviously, that's going to be a little bit similar to the participant as observer, and there's kind of a fine line between the two. But the observer as participant would not be quite as involved in the day-to-day activities as participant as observer would be. A bit more of a distance, standing around taking notes and all that sort of thing, rather than being as directly involved. And finally, we have research partners. And so, if an example of this would be if a teacher were to tell a class about the research and say, hey, how would all of you like to join in with me in my research? Would you like to become my research partners? And that doesn't really happen very often. Where you see that more really is in the physical sciences, really in the life sciences. And you read an article that has 100 authors, and they're listing everybody everybody who works in the lab, basically, from the lead researchers down to the graduate students who wash test tubes. Well, that's another possibility. The idea of triangulation is very important in ethnographic or qualitative research. This is basically where it doesn't necessarily triangulation, the triangle part of the word suggests there's at least three. There don't have to be three, but there does have to be more than one for you to be triangulating. And so you might, if you're going to, let's say if we were talking about the campus transportation problem here at Georgia Southern, we might start out with a survey, and then on the survey ask if there are people who are willing to be interviewed, and then from the survey we would get people to ask questions, delve more deeply than the survey, and then we might also shadow, where we might ride the bus and ask people, maybe try to engage people in conversations about the campus transportation problem, as well as just sitting and listening and describing what we see going on around us. So, another way of looking at these multiple perspectives is in terms of the data that you derive from what you may do as part of your study, and then how you apply the theory to that data, And then the researchers themselves, they have their own perspective, especially when they do things like deep descriptions, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. But the thing to remember about triangulation is that you're trying various methods to get the same information to see if your perspective on that data is valid. You know, do students indeed not like the bus system or what have you? So one thing that you'll notice about ethnographic or qualitative research is that it does try to imitate the quantitative research or positivism, that type of the use of creating experiments and all that sort of thing, and having control groups, the type of structure that is provided to a scientific study. And so you'll see that very often ethnographic or qualitative research will uh, have the MRAD structure, where you have the introduction, and in the introduction you would have the hypothesis, a quick review of the literature of some sort, and then the methodology, description of what you're going to do and perhaps why you're going to do it. And again, often the review of the lit can lead you to the methodology. And then the results will be the data you derive from whatever it is that you do, and the discussion you uh, write about the implications or the significance of your data. So, someone who is interested in doing pure qualitative research, especially in ethnographies, uh, very often will not deviate from their methodological approach. What I mean by that is, if, for example, we're going to go to study the Yanomami, you wouldn't try to do anything like surveys. And in terms of doing surveys, you could do that if you wanted to with a group like that. You could just ask them, orally ask them questions and record what they say. But again, the strict ethnographer is going to rely upon observation and participation, that sort of thing. So, but others do mix the two, and there's actually another form of research methodology we refer to as mixed. Some people do make that distinction, where you might be doing observation, but you're also maybe doing surveys and applying statistical applications to derive meaning from your data. Here's something we haven't talked about so much, but something that students have done when I've taught this class in the past. I have taught it where I strictly focused on qualitative research and assigned students to find a business that they could study for the business communication practices. And so, if you want to do something like that, you do need to get permission, and they need to be the person who is allowing you to do field work at their business needs to know that I am your supervisor ultimately. So if they have any questions, any concerns, they know who they can get in touch with at Georgia Southern. And so if you want to do something like this, let me know and we'll get something like this ready for you. You can see that it kind of lays out different types of aspects of the field work that in terms of doing something like collecting writing samples would only be done with their permission. Some organizations won't want you taking written material out of their organization, or maybe even looking at it. Certain, uh, like things like plans for what they're going to do for their business. There's, I'm sure you've heard, there are things like recipes that are kept under lock and key at some businesses. And of course, even a business like Microsoft guards its code very carefully. And that's how it would end. So, but The organization point of contact, I mean, if you were doing an internship and you decided you wanted to study your internship this semester, yeah, that is something you could conceivably do. And your organization point of contact would be basically, it should be your supervisor. Though it depends upon how the business wants to do it. I mean, if you were working for a big international corporation, you wouldn't have the president of the company. However, if you were working for a family owned business, then perhaps the person who would want to be in charge would be the owner of the business, or your point of contact would be the owner of the business. So, in terms of your methodologies, literature search is certainly important. Observation is another one that we've talked about. Field notes. Very often, especially with a big long term project, even if it's only maybe 10 weeks or so, you may develop a notebook where you keep all kinds of written materials, transcripts of conversations, uh, deep descriptions, maps of a building, or uh, hierarchical charts, what have you, interviews. These are all possibilities to help you make sense of the data that you may collect. Flowcharts are good for showing processes. And in this case, if you were thinking about workplace communication, you might think about the process that a document goes through before it's completed. Shadowing notes, can be very important, and that's another good way of finding information. Sometimes that can be linked with like a write aloud protocol where you have the person that you're shadowing speak aloud their thoughts as they go about a process, or go about a day or a few hours or what have you. And written artifacts are certainly important and can be rhetorically analyzed. Published accounts could be something that was written about an organization and published in a newspaper or another magazine or online. It could be a review of an organization. Surveys certainly can be important. So the literature search, a lot of times that can tell you to what extent you want to engage in a particular project. It could be that you may find that a lot has been done on the project, and so you may just want to stop whatever it is that you were planning and go on to something else. But not necessarily. The thing you have to ask yourself is even though perhaps a business like you'd like to study has been studied before, but have they been studied in the particular way that you want to do it? Or has the technology changed since the last study was done to the extent that a new study, even one that is similar to the one that was done before, would be useful? Okay, here we are in a thick description. If you like to write thick fiction, you'll like thick description. This is where you go and you sit somewhere and you describe everything that's going on around you. You might appeal to the senses. Of course, what you see, but also what you hear, perhaps what you smell. Are there any tastes associated with the place? Um, and of course, anything that you might feel, any in terms of tactile, um, appeal to that sense. Or it could be feel in terms of how you respond to a place emotionally as well. With a thick description, you want to avoid as much as you can editorializing. In technical communication, we recognize that when a person sits down to write something, that they bring a certain perspective, a certain set of experiences to the table, and so all that's going to affect what you ultimately that you write. You might think as well about the level of detail. Though generally with thick description you get all that you can with that description, and then you may go back and edit it down. Now the thick description can be useful perhaps for the introduction, or you may want to take it and use it throughout different portions of your report. So in terms of observation, first you do need to negotiate access to the site, as we were talking about. You have to have permission. And I'm going to take care of doing an IRB for the class, and I'll let you know about that as soon as I get it done. Technically, you're not supposed to start any type of research until I get that. So, but since we're a class, it shouldn't take too long. And they have lifted the ban on face-to-face research, though I myself would, encourage you to, if you're doing interviews, to use Zoom or Google Hangouts, and you can actually, if the person that you're interviewing gives you permission, you can actually record it. Still a good idea to take notes in case it fails. So in terms of familiarizing yourself with the observation site, that's where perhaps drawing yourself a map may come in handy, and it can be useful to you to refer to when you're thinking about writing up your material. So, but it helps you to situate it and to picture the place in your mind. And then you actually conduct the observation. So artifacts are not only do you collect them, but you also create them yourself. And that can range from data from a survey to what you've written in a deep description. So in terms of collecting artifacts, you need to think about your objectivity. Um, why is it that you're interested in this particular artifact? Is there any particular reason that you want to collect it? It's always a good idea to ask members of the community for feedback on your work as you're doing it. That can help you to maintain objectivity. And you can also think in terms of doing a pilot study. That is, a pilot study is more or less a dry run, and a lot of times people will do these for like a master's thesis or doctoral dissertation. They'll do a pilot study to see how whatever it is that they want to do works. Maybe with just a few people, and then they'll try it with the entire population, like of a company or something like that, after they've tried it with a few people to try to work out any types of problems that occurred. In terms of potential research problems, you can always have problems with subjects. A real typical one is at the beginning of a project, people volunteer to be a part of it, and then as they start actually becoming involved, maybe it starts taking up more time than they realize that it actually would, and they tend to drag their feet and not turn things in when you need them, or sometimes they want to drop out completely. And so it's, all you can do is the best that you can and explain to people the importance and the significance of what they're doing. And you may think in terms of compromising and perhaps easing up on some of your requirements if that's doable to keep people from dropping out. Another problem can come with employers. Again, they may think, oh, yeah, it's a great idea. You're going to study workplace communication, but then it may seem like that you're taking up more time than they want you to, or it could be that you're sticking your nose where they don't want you to stick your nose. Um, so again, it's something that you have to be prepared for and be prepared to compromise. Losing data, and of course, uh, losing data can occur where you just leave a notebook somewhere and never see it again, or of course, you can also a jump drive can choose to uh, become destroyed when or not work anymore when you've after you finish collecting data and storing it on it. So it's a good idea to back up everything that you can. With artifacts, it's a good idea to Xerox material and keep it somewhere else so that you don't lose it. It's important to stay organized. With a bigger project, again, a good loose leaf notebook is a good idea where you have things printed out. Even if you're keeping everything on your computer, it's a good idea to print it out, punch holes, and put it in a notebook and keep the notebook, at home or something. And of course, you want to remember to do no harm. You don't want to do any type of research that's going to cause somebody anxiety. And on the job, that could be, you don't want to cause anxiety for anybody in terms of how they feel about their job or their relationship to their employer or anything like that. You don't want to hurt anybody's chances of getting a promotion or a raise through data that you collect and then make public. Questions? I've got another study that we can look at as well. That's an actual study that was done. That was part of some material that I was working with in the past that you can look at. So, otherwise, I'll see you online.